What's up, everybody? My name is Scott Paddock, and today we are going to talk about approach notes. Approach notes are a great technique that you can use to add a whole bunch of movement to your lines. It makes it sound like more weaving bebop lines. It just makes everything so that it doesn't sound so scalar. Scalar meaning like you're just playing like a major scale or a minor scale. When you add these approach notes in, the lines really come alive because you are introducing some notes that are not inside of the scale, but the notes flow really nicely because of the way we use approach notes. Before we dive into the tutorial, I'd like to take a second to thank Legere Reeds for sponsoring my last series of videos. Throughout the last 8 videos, I've been telling you all the things I love about Legere, and I really also love their support. I've been playing their reeds for a while. I've been an endorsing artist of theirs for a while, and I really, really love their reeds. I tell everyone about them, and whenever one of my friends or I see someone playing a cane reed, I try to bring them to the light of not having to worry about reeds anymore and checking out a Legere Signature, which is my favorite kind. I use the 2.25 on my alto. So I'd like to throw a big thank you out there to Legere Reeds for sponsoring my videos for the last month or so. I really appreciate their support and I love their product. So what is an approach note? An approach note is exactly like what it sounds. It is a note that you're going to use to lead into the target note. So whatever note is your target note, you're going to lead into that note either above or below, generally by a half step. Not all the time, but the majority of the time it's going to be by a half step. So what that does is it creates a more interesting line because you're not just playing scale-wise motion, and it makes the line kind of like smoother and like it kind of weaves a little bit easier because you're using some half steps in there. So when you're landing on the target note, you're landing on it a little bit more gracefully. So you can use approach notes in melodies as well as in improv solos. So the first thing I'm going to show you is going to be in a melody, and then I'll talk about improv solos. So in a melody, I'm going to use the song Blue Bossa, just the first phrase. I'll play the very first phrase as written. So it lands on that A. That note right there. That is going to be our target note. Now the target note could be whatever note you want it to be. Generally it's going to be a strong note, but if you're using approach notes, you can kind of put them anywhere you want as long as it sounds okay. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the strongest note in the song or the resolution note in the melody. So on this one, I'm going to do it on that A, and the approach note I'm going to use is a half step below. So instead of just going right to the A, I'm going to go from a G sharp to an A. So it's going to get that winding feel to it. Take a listen to it. This is with the approach note below. So by adding that approach note, it just kind of lets the line flow a little bit more. It lets it kind of wind around a little bit more. You're going to hear me use the word winding a lot because that's the way I think of approach notes. So again, I'll play it normal and then I'll put the approach note in it. Now the approach note from below, so I'm going to play a G sharp before the A. Now you'll notice a couple things. First, I had to play some notes faster. I had to play some notes faster because I was going to add a note. If you're going to add a note, then you have to speed up some other notes. You're going to have to play, instead of playing quarter notes, add some eighth notes so that you have time to add that note. The second thing that you're going to hear is if you are familiar with enclosures, that also created an enclosure. An enclosure is when you play the scale degree above and a half step below. So the target note is A, and the note we played above the A was a B, then we went to a G sharp to an A. So we played an enclosure. And when you're doing approach notes, oftentimes you're going to create enclosures. So again, here is the approach note from below. So I'm going to play the G sharp. Now, we can also use approach notes from above. So we're going to do the exact same thing, except instead of coming from a half step below the note, we're going to come from a half step above the note. In this case, we're going to come from a B flat down to an A. So it'll sound like this. And that's an approach note. You're just setting up the target note by a half step below or a half step above. And you will hear me talk about these kind of notes oftentimes as setup notes. If you've listened to other videos of me, especially when I'm talking about articulation notes, I'll talk about setup notes. And oftentimes those are going to be the approach notes, the notes that are coming from a half step below, because their job is to set up the target note. Okay, so let's add some approach notes into another melody. This time we're going to do it over softly as in a morning sunrise. So I'll play softly as in a morning sunrise without any approach notes. And this time I will add some approach notes and I will tell you what I'm doing as I do it. There, instead of just going right to the C, I'm using an approach note before. I'm playing a B before the C. Instead of again, it just gives you more motion. It gives the line more character. So these approach notes just kind of make things sound more interesting. So let's continue with this melody. Now on the E, I came from a D sharp. And I went from a G sharp into an A. The D sharp to the E is more of a grace note. A grace note and approach note, what's the difference? The grace note is just like a little fast note that you're going to use to articulate something. An approach note is an actual note that you're using to set up the following note, the target note. So the D sharp to E that I'm playing are grace notes, but when I go to that A, I'm coming from a G sharp below, so I'm using approach notes there. So take a listen to the phrase again and you'll hear the approach note from the B to the C. You'll hear a grace note on the E, or going into the E, and then approach note from the G sharp to the A. So did you hear the difference between the grace note and the approach note? It's all about how long you're playing it and the function of that note as you play it. Now, the last part of that phrase is the way it's written. I'm going to put an approach note before the last note, which is an A. So I'm going to come from a B flat. I'm going to come from the approach note above. Now I'm going to come from an approach note from below. So I'll do the G sharp. So again, you can put the half step above or the half step below. And then again, this is what it sounds like with no approach step. Now, when it comes to improvising, you can also use approach notes, and those are used constantly in bebop. That's why those lines sound like they're weaving all over the place. They're kind of going all over the place. It doesn't sound like you're just playing a major scale. That's the difference between someone who is just learning how to improvise and they're using their major scales. So everything they play is in the exact key of the chord. And people who are using approach notes, they're using chromaticism from the approach notes to make the lines sound more interesting by not only playing notes in the major scale. So I'm going to improvise using an A major scale and using only an A major scale, and you'll kind of hear what I'm talking about. So this is just with no approach notes, just regular improv. Sounds good? Sounds perfectly fine. If you saw an A major 7 chord and you played that, everyone would be happy. There's no wrong notes. Everything is good. But if you wanted to sound more interesting, you would put some approach notes in there. So all that means is you can use any note as a target note. You're going to throw some chromaticism in there. So say you're going from B to A, you could go, instead of just going B, A, go B, B flat, A. If you're going to a C sharp, instead of just going to a C sharp, add a C natural before it. If you're going to an E natural, instead of just going to an E natural, add a D sharp before it. So I know that sounds like a lot right now as I'm just kind of like spewing out all these notes that you can add. So here's an example. I'm going to improvise in the key of A again, but this time I'm going to use approach notes. So the first note I'm going to play is a C natural because it's going to go into the C sharp. So it's an approach note on the C sharp. Do you hear that? Instead of just playing, by playing that C natural into the C sharp, it makes the line way more interesting. Okay, so you heard another note that was not in the A scale. This time I played a D sharp going into the D, and I did it chromatically. So I was coming from an E, and instead of just going down to the D, it would sound like this. Sounds perfectly fine, but if I play this D sharp, it's going to sound way more interesting. You hear that? Suddenly it sounds like a bebop line, and that bebop line comes from adding approach notes. In other words, like adding chromaticism into your line. Again, did you hear that other chromatic note? I played a B flat in going into the A. So between the B and the B, or between the B and the A, I played a B flat, just to kind of give it that motion. Again, I could use this over an A major scale. It would sound over an A major 7 chord, and it would sound fantastic, even though I'm playing notes that aren't in the A major 7 chord, because I'm using them as approach notes. In other words, I'm using them as setup notes, go between notes into the more important notes. Now, another way you can do it is on chords, doing a half step below. You can use approach notes all over the place. So the way I have my students usually start with approach notes is doing it in a melody. Once you start to hear it in a melody, that makes it a little bit easier to figure out how to actually make them work and make the timing work. Then once you're really comfortable with that, start improvising and figure out in advance where you're going to put an approach note. So before the A, we're going to approach it from B flat, or before E, we're going to come from an F natural or a D sharp. Kind of work them out in advance and try and get used to the sound of it. And once you hear the sound, it's going to become really natural and you're going to start throwing them in all over the place. So approach notes are just another way of talking about putting chromaticism into your lines to make them sound way more interesting and not just sound like boring major scales or minor scales lines. I'd like to throw another shout out to Legere Reeds for sponsoring my videos for the last month or so. I really appreciate their support. And if you have not tried a Legere Signature and you are a saxophone player, I strongly suggest that you check them out. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. If you now know how approach notes work, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. If you have any questions or any other topics you'd like me to go over, leave me a comment below. Thanks a lot.